Hi, welcome to your second to last lecture. This is the one dealing with Wheeler, Becker, Glover, Volume 2, Chapter 9, and this one then deals with the 1960 campaign for civil rights, although you'll sort of notice soon that I'm not going to talk much about the 1960 campaign. Instead, I'm going to focus on some events leading up to it. So one of the really major trends in civil rights history is to come to the realization that the civil rights movement was not just limited to the era 1954 to 1964, nor was it limited simply to the South. Instead, historians talk about something called the long civil rights movement. So this is a recognition that all the way from 1877, that's the end of Reconstruction, through 1954, and 1954 is the date associated with the Brown versus Board of Education case, African Americans have been active. And I should mention, too, not just African Americans, but also white Americans have been active on the part of civil rights, too. So we've talked in many of the other lectures about different things that African Americans have done to respond to the conditions they face, particularly in the South. One of the things we talked about was the migration out of the South, and I mentioned that there was a wave in the late 19th century as many African Americans moved to cities like New York and even Boston as a way of taking advantage of some of the factory work that was appearing in those cities. But then we also saw that migration occurred during World War I, and this actually refers to the Great Migration. African Americans moved out of the South in huge numbers during World War I and moved to places, again, like New York, but also to places like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis to take advantage of the factory work offered as part of the war. And the same thing happened during World War II, and we didn't talk about it much. It gets mentioned very briefly in the text. But this is actually where you see a lot of African Americans making their move to the West. Not that this hadn't occurred prior to World War II, but it really is significant during World War II because there are so many defense industries located on the West Coast in places like Los Angeles. And so Los Angeles really sees a surge in its African American population during World War II. You've also seen in a former chapter leadership in the Black community from people like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And the other thing that your text mentions, particularly in this chapter, are the challenges to Jim Crow laws that were made by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People throughout the 20th century. And again, the NAACP was the institution that was started in part by W.E.B. Du Bois, but it was an interracial, meaning a black and white organization. And if you remember from an earlier chapter, for example, Frances Harper was one of the people who had joined, and she was a white woman who was active on the part of civil rights. So some of the challenges to Jim Crow laws were actually successful leading up to the 1950s, and the textbook notes that Thurgood Marshall's team, and this is the lawyer who challenges Brown successfully, had already previously won cases centered on graduate and professional education in segregated public universities in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. And the picture you see there is actually the generation before Thurgood Marshall. This is a picture of Walter White, the NAACP executive secretary, with his team of attorneys, Charles Houston, James Tyson, Leon Ransom, and Edward Lovett. And again, you can see that there is interracial cooperation. And I think sometimes that aspect gets a little lost too, that in fact, much of the civil rights movement was an interracial movement. So I think we're all fairly familiar with some of the events leading up to the activism of the 1960s. So I don't want to go into much detail about this, especially as this last week of class is a short week. But the crucial events of the 1950s do include the successful challenge to segregation mounted in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And so you can see Thurgood Marshall there, the lead lawyer for the NAACP. But the text also notes that with this successful challenge to segregation comes the massive resistance in the South, as exemplified in Little Rock, Arkansas. And in 1957, of course, Little Rock High School actually tried to integrate. They had black students who were coming to the high school, and this was the reaction of the white students to one of those black students. And so, there were challenges with regard to the desegregation of public schools. Another crucial event of the 1950s is the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. That's the year after, obviously, the Brown case. It seems everybody knows about Rosa Parks getting arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person. And so there's a picture of her getting arrested. Her arrest helped to spark the Montgomery bus boycott, where African Americans simply refused to ride on the segregated buses of Montgomery. And the boycott ended in 1956 when the Supreme Court declared that these kinds of buses were unconstitutional. And so the other picture there is of Martin Luther King. The Montgomery bus boycott is not only important for Rosa Parks' resistance, but it's also really important for really launching Martin Luther King Jr. as a civil rights leader. He is the one who really organizes the boycott and really helps keep the boycott energized through the year of activism. Some other crucial events in the 1950s, maybe these are a little bit less well known depending on where you're coming from, but several individuals from the black community also break through the color barrier. So Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. Gwendolyn Brooks won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1950. So those are some of the political and arts-related kinds of accomplishments. But then maybe a little bit more famous, at least that would have been the case for my father, Jackie Robinson is notable, of course, for breaking the color barrier in professional baseball and began playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers all the way in 1947. And the National Basketball Association has 4 African American players starting in 1950. But really, it's the career of Bill Russell that makes the achievement of African Americans in basketball notable, because he really emerges as the first black superstar playing for the Boston Celtics in 1956. Another crucial event of the 1950s is the event associated with the killing of Emmett Till. And I realize that your textbook points out that there are a number of African American men who are murdered. Sam Hose is mentioned, Emmett Till is mentioned, Medgar Evans is mentioned. And so maybe one of the questions is, why focus on Emmett Till? I think Emmett Till is an important person to focus on because in some ways, his death, maybe because he's 14 years old, really helps to energize the whole nation around the issue of civil rights. So yeah, he's a 14-year-old boy. He lives in Chicago, but in 1955, he visited some relatives down in Mississippi. One of the things that folks point out about Emmett Till was that he really was somebody who had very little experience with the customs in the South. And so when he visited the South, he didn't act the way that African Americans were, allegedly, supposedly supposed to act. So he wasn't obeying the social customs to begin with. And of course, the biggest violation was to make some sort of sexual contact with a white woman. And so his was some kind of a wolf whistle at Carolyn Bryant. Carolyn Bryant was married, and she and her husband owned a store, and the store sold, a number of things to sharecroppers and their families. And so Emmett was there with a cousin. They went into the store. Carolyn Bryant was sort of a local beauty, and Emmett Till whistled at her. Well, they didn't report the incident to the people that they were staying with, Emmett and his cousin, and within a couple of days, Carolyn Bryant's husband, Roy, along with his half-brother, J.W. Millam, went to the house where Emmett was staying and demanded that the person, the guy who was in charge of the house, give them Emmett. And so they demanded to see Emmett, and they took him away in a vehicle, and nobody ever saw him alive again. Instead, days later, Emmett's body was found in the Tallahatchie River, tied to a cotton gin fan, and of course the body was also, it was fairly unrecognizable. It was quite beaten up, and pieces of the body were missing. So when Till's mother came down to get the body, or when she received the body back in Chicago, she claimed that the funeral director asked her if she wanted him to fix the body up. And Till's mother reportedly said to him, there's no way that you can fix that up. But instead of having a closed casket, Till's mother decided to display what had happened to her son in an open casket, and pictures of the severely mutilated body ran in Jet magazine, a magazine that was popular for African Americans. Well, what was interesting was that Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, actually did go to trial. But at the trial, they were declared not guilty by an all-white jury. Most of the juries were all white. And because they were declared not guilty, and you can't be convicted of the same crime twice, that's double jeopardy, they actually confessed to the crime for a magazine publication called Look magazine. And they talked about how they had beaten him and how they weren't planning to kill him, but he was defiant enough that they decided to teach him a lesson. And so these series of events, the killing of a 14-year-old boy, and then two men getting, who were obviously guilty, then getting off for the crime, seemed like an egregious travesty of justice. And there were a number of things that made this come to national attention, not just sort of an isolated Southern incident. So the list includes, the publication of photos in Jet magazine. That really helps unite the African American community. The confession of the killers in Look magazine. Again, this is a national publication. So you have white and black audiences throughout the nation reading about, the white perspective on proper racial behaviors and how 14-year-old boys have to die because they whistle at white women. And the coverage in the coverage of the trial in national newspapers and television also helped energize the civil rights movement. The role of television is absolutely critical in the civil rights movement of the 1950s. It's what convinces Eisenhower to actually send troops down to Little Rock to protect the soldiers, because he's actually watching these black students try to go to school amidst all of the taunts from the white students. And it's what helps white folks in the North who didn't really realize what was maybe going on in the South, or didn't want to realize what was going on in the South, help them have an understanding of the really problematic situation surrounding race in this country in the 1950s. So civil rights in the 1960s. The textbook points out, and I think this is a really important point, which is why I'm reprinting it here, that despite all of the progress in the 1950s, to a large degree, the burgeoning civil rights movement had stalled by the end of the 1950s. And many conservative black and white leaders urged the gradual dismantling of Jim Crow and the pursuit of justice through the federal courts. And this was a protracted process. So, a lot of people that were sort of part of the old guard of the civil rights movement suggested that, hey, we had gotten this victory in Brown, and we'll continue to fight through the court system. But of course, critics are pointing out, well, shoot, 1877 to 1954, that's a long period of time before we actually see justice here. And, how long is this really going to take? And the other thing that the text points out is that most African American parents, hoping to protect their children, continued to teach them how to negotiate Jim Crow, not challenge it. Because really, do you want what happened to Emmett Till to happen to your child? No, of course you don't. So it seemed really risky to challenge Jim Crow directly. But for the younger generation, this was not enough. So the textbook really points out that in the face of this more conservative viewpoint, we have this generation gap where young people were increasingly dubious of their parents' generation and values, particularly the values of, what seemed like accommodation or too little progress. And many in the rising generation then viewed gradual challenges to segregation with skepticism. And you can see that reflected in the evidence section in this chapter, where, it almost seems like there's a switch that gets flicked for these four young men, and they decide, that's it. That's it. We're not going to take it anymore. It's ridiculous that Woolworths, which is happy to receive our money for the purchase of, toothpaste, is not happy to serve us in the cafeteria or at the lunch counter. I mean, this is just absolutely ridiculous, inconsistent, and we're not going to take this anymore. And we don't mind getting arrested. And this is a badge of honor rather than something to be ashamed of. The other last thing I just want to mention briefly is the Black Power movement. This is something that's on the rise already by the mid-1960s. And it's interesting to note that the Black Power movement is growing despite the fact that you actually do get significant progress on civil rights. I mean, you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The provisions of this Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. And you also have the Black Power movement growing despite the Voter Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. And so, what's the appeal of the Black Power movement? It really still is, in some ways, part of this generation gap. It's popular for these especially younger African Americans who are still frustrated with the lack of progress on civil rights. And while maybe there are certain things that are being taken care of by way of legislation, there are still major and continuing problems. For some of these young people, they're focusing on problems of urban poverty. And they're not looking just at problems associated with the South. They're actually looking at problems associated with the West and the North. And Northerners might have been comfortable fighting for civil rights when it dealt with the South, but it's hard to deal with civil rights when it's happening in your own backyard. They're also frustrated with police brutality and a number of other issues that are less related to outright legal practices, but in some ways the internal racism that occurred that led to certain kinds of social practices. And your textbook points out then that Black Power appealed also because of the focus on self-reliance and self-defense, but it should also point it out that it's also appealing because of its message of Black pride. And in that sense, you should hear Ida B. Wells echoing in the back of your mind. You should be hearing some of the other leaders who are saying, if white people think we're good enough for them, that's their problem. We have a sense of our own worth, and we have a sense of entitlement, and we don't need them to fight this fight. And so some of the organizations like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, actually changed their names, and I think that gets mentioned to the Student National Coordinating Committee to emphasize its lack of need for white folks in the organization. I think that's a little unfortunate, but I think it's also a little bit understandable. Okay, well, good luck with the chapter, and I'll look forward to reading your discussion posts.